All right, let's go ahead and get started. I have 8:15. I see I've got a few people that have logged on. I apologize for the late start today. I got caught in traffic, and as much as I would have loved to have just run people over, I can't do that. So thank you all for being patient and logging on a little bit late. I am going to go ahead and go till 9 o'clock tonight, so it'll be about 45 minutes. And so. We kind of had a little bit of a timing concern with the way we set things up in release. So we actually kind of delayed in new content. But we should have all the economic development and industrialization content up now. So all those videos are available for you to review and look at. Next week, urbanization will be up, and we'll do a broadcast about urbanization. Also want to let you know that in a couple of weeks, after the urbanization unit, we will put up some kind of study skills, study review kinds of things. So let me go ahead and address some questions. So I'm not going to address these in the exact order that they are on the page. So once again, remember that my chat function does not work. So if you have a question, go ahead and put it on the questions page, and I will answer them as I can. So I want to start with half of a question asked by Debbie. It's kind of the most recent question, actually, but it actually is pretty important, I think. And she asks, what within the models and theories should we focus on, and is there any specific unit that has been tested on more than others? So a couple of things, a couple of ways that I want to respond to that. One is if you go to the very first week's questions, in there I posted a link to an infographic, and the infographic basically has a breakdown of all of the questions, the FRQs that have been asked. From 2001, I believe, to 2013 or 13 or 14. And in there, it breaks them down all kinds of different ways. And this is actually a really good way to think about it. So if you get a chance, you should go look at that. There's lots of good information. That link is on the first week's page, but I am going to give you the URL if you have time to look at it. If not, you can go look at it on your own, okay? And the URL is magic.pictochart.com/output/217-0516-AP-human-FRQs. Or FRQS, excuse me. If you put that in, it should take you to a really cool infographic. And I'm going to tell you about some of the things that are on that infographic. So to kind of start the conversation. So the question is all the material covered equally? Is there material that's been covered more? And if so, what material is on there? So I think there are some patterns to think about. You should go back and look at this infographic and listen to the information that I'm about to give you. All right, I'm not going to go through everything on the infographic, but I'm going to talk about some of the things that are kind of important here. Okay, first of all, if we look at a list of the number of times that a concept or unit has occurred, it's pretty balanced. Okay, so for example, economics has been on there 9 times. Population and migration has been on there 7 times. Agriculture and land use 7 times. Urban 7 times. Culture is 6 times. Population, political is 6 times. So everything, all 7 units have been on the test, or 6 units have been on the test, a minimum of 6 times. So that's quite a bit. So you want to make sure that you're balancing out your study approach, that you're balancing out the things that you work on, so that you're not spending too much time on one section at the detriment of others, because they do like to cover everything. All right. I'm also going to go through a list of specific concepts that have been covered on previous tests. So include what might be on the multiple choice. But as a general rule, if they think it's important enough to create an FRQ, chances are that material is going to find its way into the multiple choice if it's not already in there. So these are some concepts that I would be kind of conscious of. And some of these might sound a little weird, but that's okay. So for example, the first, we have the Green Revolution. We have Rostow's model. We have North American city growth. We have religion and landscape, nation in the state, women in the city, European migration, effects of tourism, core periphery issues, maquiladoras, demographics in the city, U.S. immigration, supranationalism and devolution, revitalization, 20th century migration streams, southern businesses, or that deindustrialization concept, forces. I'm not sure what that means. I'll have to look that one up. 2006 forces. I mean, Thunen, English and lingua franca, International Division of Labor, North American net in and out migration, von Thunen versus the Burgess model, gender and education, decline of dairy farms, religious distribution in the U.S., squatter settlements, population pyramids, Weber, national identity, Thomas Malthus, automobile industry, Mexican cities, subsistence agriculture, Muslim migration, barriers, graying populations, technopoles, railroads and highways, coffee production, Rostow versus Wallerstein, and superimposed boundaries. Those are all some of the concepts that have been covered on previous FRQs. Now, there are some of those are more specific. For example, the Mexican cities one, yes, it was using Mexico as an example, but really that was a primate city question. Okay, the questions about subsistence agriculture was about shifting cultivation, and so just kind of knowing some of these kind of big concepts that have been on there before. One, it tells you what the test writers have valued in the past and what they probably will continue to value. Kind of helps to focus in on what that might be. Once again, we have no idea what's going to be on those FRQs. I wish we did, but we really have no way of knowing that ahead of time. All right. But once again, I highly, highly, highly recommend what you call it? Yeah, infographic. That I linked on the very first set of questions for the very first one that we did. And it has a lot more information that I'm not really able to go into very well in this kind of format, but something that you should look at as you prepare. Okay, so find that infographic, check that stuff out, and things like that. All right, so that's important stuff, very, very important stuff. So use that as a starting point. Now, to the other half of Debbie's question, which is what within the models and theories should we focus on? And okay, so models and theories. I don't know if you mean across units or if you mean just in one unit, but here are some models you should be familiar with. You should be familiar with the demographic transition model. It is an incredibly important concept. You should be knowledgeable about laws of migration. You should be knowledgeable about nation state theories, some of those kinds of things in terms of the way that maybe the organic state model. Be familiar with von Thunen. Be familiar with the different liberalist versus structuralist models. So Wallerstein versus Rostow. Know those urban location models, especially Otelling and Weber. And some of those models are going to be very, very important. When you get to the urban unit, where there's a lot of different stuff, I would say the most important one to be aware of are the North American models and how they kind of evolve over time and what causes that evolution. I think one of the challenges is, especially in the urban unit, there's already a lot of models, and a lot of those models are, that's a field of geography that's constantly growing and updating itself, and so there's new models being developed. From my experience, I would focus on some of the more traditional, older material in that. I don't see them asking a lot of questions about some of the newer, more emerging models, just because they're not as well embedded into the literature, into the text, into the curriculum, and so therefore they may not. I personally don't think it would be fair to ask about them yet. I don't think it's time for that. Be familiar with those, but for the test purposes, if you look at those North American models, if you look at the Borchardt model, maybe the Adams model, which I call the Starfish model, know about how developing world or LDC's urban models are different. I don't know that I would commit a whole lot of time to memorizing every single detail on those models, but how are those different than what we see in North America, things like that. So be familiar with all of those kinds of things. Theories, which ones do we talk the most about? Which ones are the most established and seem to have held up the best over time? Are things that I would focus on. Like I said, all of these fields are constantly growing and evolving. There's always new scholarship. There's always new theories and new explanations of things, and that's awesome and that's great. And I think that's one of the things I really love about human geography is that constant change and growth and evolution of the field. But I would still, when it comes to the test, remember to focus on what are the things that are kind of more traditional and have held up over time and tend to be broader in their ability to explain or have high levels of correlation to what we know. Now, some of those other things may be great as examples to toss in here or there, but I wouldn't try to know everything, and that's one of the things that at this point in your preparation is kind of an important thing to talk about. So I'm going to toss this out there because Daniel has asked a question about what is the best way to study for the AP exam. I've actually covered this a couple times, but I'll be glad to cover it again. Daniel, if you're interested, I did also kind of talk about this on that very first week as well in the comments on the questions page. But I'll go ahead and throw out some things to remember. One is you're not going to be able to memorize and know everything you could possibly be asked. So what I would do is kind of start focusing on what are the big concepts, looking back at that, the outline that goes with every chapter. If you don't have access to that, ask your teacher, okay? The College Board gives us an outline that we use to plan the course. And in that outline, it has the major points that we are expected to cover. So what you want to do is make sure that you look at that outline and say, okay, what does this mean? What are the key concepts, key vocabulary, key ideas? It is in, what do those things look like? And use that as a starting point. And then ask myself, what do I need to know? What can I come up with? What do I feel comfortable with? What do I not feel comfortable with, right? So use that as a starting point. Then I would go back and I would start to look at my notes and say, okay, when I was taking notes, what did I understand? What did I know? What did I not? And I would start on the things that I felt less comfortable with first, okay? And starting with those kind of concepts and those ideas, go with that first, okay? Spend some more of your time on those things. Looking at vocabulary, looking at those big concepts, looking at those models. One of the things that's been happening with the FRQs in recent years is the blending of different units into the FRQs. So they'll be pulling from different units in those from time to time and blend them together. So be able to look at what are some things that are some themes or some concepts that go across units, right? How does population relate to development, or how does politics relate to agriculture, or maybe some of those kind of cross-unit connections as well be thinking about. In terms of just general study strategies, there are some very important things to keep in mind. One is you need to set aside a time, you need to set aside a consistent time, and you need to hold yourself to that. So you need to say, okay, I'm going to study for an hour a day. And then say, okay, every Tuesday night from, 8:30 to 9:30 or 8 to 10 or whatever, 1 to 2 hours a night at this point in the process would probably be appropriate. And when you do that, you need to be serious about it. Okay, so you need to put your cell phone away. You need to be in a place that you're not going to be distracted by the television, by the computer, by your iPad, by whatever it is, right? I know, guys. I have learned to be a good studier and a good student, but not until very recently in my life, in the last 3-4 years, right? All through my high school, college, and graduate school, I was not a very good student because I didn't do these things. I recommend finding a quiet place with free of distractions. Okay, I recommend the public library if you can access it. I recommend. If you have access to your school library before or after school, going in there and spending some time there. Find an environment that's going to be conducive to study, conducive to working, not one that's going to provide you with lots of distractions and lots of things that are going to get in the way of being successful. Okay. I really recommend that you read your notes. Okay, and I would even recopy your notes. And you're thinking, Mr. C, that's crazy talk. Why would I want to recopy all of these, five subject spiral full of notes again? Because scientists have kind of found research that say that the actual physical action of writing things down, of actually writing it. You're welcome, Debbie. Of writing those things down actually helps you commit it to memory. Okay, because when you're writing things down, you're having to do multiple processes at the same time. All right, so going back and looking at your notes and rewriting them, maybe rephrasing them, putting them in different words. If there's things that are graphical, I would draw them. Draw your models, draw your maps, draw the connections between things. Use graphic organizers like concept maps. Maybe put Green Revolution in the middle and have all kinds of little things coming off that you can put in pros on one side or cons on another. Do T-charts. Do anything that you can do that actually gets you physically interacting with the material instead of passively just rereading everything. Okay, not that you shouldn't be looking over your notes and rereading parts of the book that you aren't familiar with, but the more you do with your notes, the better. Some of you may use Quizlet. I think Quizlet is a great tool. I do, however, still firmly believe that as great as Quizlet is, an old-fashioned set of note cards with a pen and a definition on one side and a term on another is just as good, if not better at times, because it forces you to write, forces you to go through that tactile, action-based activity around learning and around studying. Okay, guys, you absolutely, at this point of the process, we're a little over 2 weeks out, you need to be doing practice FRQs. Do as many as you can get your hands on. Do one every day. Okay, time yourself. Give yourself about 20 minutes a piece and see what you can do. All right, because you're only going to have about an hour to write 3, so you're going to want to use about 20 minutes a piece to write them. And when you practice, do as many as you possibly can. There are, this is the 13th year of the test, so there's like almost 50 of them out there. You ought to be able to find all these different ones that you can be working with and writing with. Okay, if you go to the College Board website, those questions are there. You can look at them. They have sample responses. They have score breakdowns. They have rubrics about how the actual essays were graded, what the graders were looking for. I think a lot of my students in the past, one of the problems that they've had is they thought, well, I'm just going to memorize everything I can and do really well on the multiple choice, and then I won't have to spend much time on the writing. And those students do not do well. They get 1s and 2s, and a couple of them get 3s. The ones that do well are the ones that do that, but they also practice writing. Okay, I know that that's not always a fun thing. I know that that's kind of a time-consuming thing, but that's really a big key to this. Use that time. Do one of these every day, and kind of practice. If you are struggling with the writing process on FRQs, look at my videos that I have posted here on the MOOC. Look at my How to FRQ. I lay out a process that I teach my students, that I learned from Ms. Granquist, who does our other live broadcast, who does the written material on the website. She taught me how to do this. It's been very successful with me and with my students. You look at that video, see the process that we follow, go through those steps. When you are writing, you need to plan. Plan your essay, plan your writing. All right. One of the problems that we see when we read these things is that we have kind of we have three groups of students. We have students that get it and they write good, solid responses. We have students that don't know anything, so they dump everything on the page, right? And we end up having to sort through it to find points, and it's just not a good thing. On the other end of the spectrum, we have students that don't know anything, so they write all these very, very general statements with no details and no specifics, and nothing that really shows us that you really have a deep understanding of the concepts, right? So be that person in the middle. Practice, so you can be that person in the middle who writes in an efficient and knowledgeable way about these concepts, so that you can do really well on those. Guys, the students that get 4s and 5s do well on both parts. It's not an issue of one or the other. Okay, these concepts kind of recur. I personally believe that the writing is more important in my class, because that's really higher level thinking skills that I want to see from you. So that's where I would make sure to put some time between now and the end of the term. If you don't have a prep book, or you don't have access to that kind of information, ask around. I think it's a good idea to study in groups every once in a while. Okay, so maybe once a week, get together and kind of go through. I lost my train of thought. I'm sorry. Yes, do study groups. Now, study groups can be good and they can be bad. If you choose a study group with people that are going to be serious about studying and serious about planning, and people that are not going to use that time to goof around. All right. I know that it's fun to be in study groups with your friends, but if they're not going to use that time well, if they're going to goof around, don't be in study groups with them. Tell them, hey, you're my buddy, but I really got to focus, and I need to be in a group that's going to help me do that. Okay. So I think it's important to mix it up. I think it's important to do lots of different things. Find things that work well for you. Don't do things that aren't working well for you. Find some other things to do. But it's about time. It's about focus. It's about studying smarter, not necessarily longer or harder. Don't study for 5 or 6 hours a night. Study for 1. Study for 2. Okay. Don't cram the night before. The night before the test, you should get lots of sleep. Go to bed pretty early so that you wake up refreshed with lots of energy. Eat a reasonable breakfast the day before the test. Okay. Don't stay up all night studying, walk into the test, have a monster for breakfast and think you're going to do well. All right. It's just not a good practice to do. Okay. And guys, those are good practices for life. Okay. Those are life lessons from Mr. C, from someone who spent a lot of years being a very poor student, a very poor studier, and greatly underachieved because of it. Okay. Take my word for it. These are good things to do. All right. It's very good to organize things, to structure things, to think about connections, think about commonalities, think about how things are related to each other. Okay. All right. I'm getting lots of questions here, kind of following up about where things are located. Tina is on there. Tina's kind of like my personal assistant here on the on the discussion. She kind of directs traffic on the question board. Thank you, Tina, for doing that. You did that well last week as well. I appreciate that. Yeah, so all of these broadcasts are recorded. They're on the YouTube channel. They should be linked to the MOOC page. So if you want to go back and look at a previous week, if you want to go back and look at the content from earlier in the review sessions, all of those are there. All right. And those are some things to kind of think about. All right. I am going to, so going back and looking at these questions, some of the earlier ones that I skipped over because of some needs to talk about studying was, what should we focus in terms for the agriculture unit? Ironically, agriculture to me is one of the ones that has some of the least vocabulary in terms in it, but some of the bigger concepts. All right. So I definitely would be familiar with different types of agriculture in terms of some specific things. So what do we talk about when we say Mediterranean or intensive subsistence or shifting cultivation? What do those things look like? What do we mean when we say plantation? What do we mean when we say cash crop? What do you mean when we say informal agriculture? What do we mean when we talk about the Green Revolution and all of its many different permutations and pros and cons and things like that? Excuse me. Be familiar with those ideas of the von Thunen model, knowing where stuff comes from and why it comes from there, and how land is distributed. Know about pastoralism and how pastoralism works and why it works and why it doesn't work. Know about some of those revolutions and those evolutions and changes over time in agriculture, especially the ones that are tied closely to industry. Being familiar with those kind of things. Understand how what the impact and ramifications are of agriculture going from subsistence to commercial. So when people start using this as a primary means, how does that affect the production? How does it affect the price? How does it affect the cost? How does it affect people on both ends of that? What are some of the pros and cons of that? Okay, a lot of the stuff is all stuff that I've covered in previous videos, and you are welcome to go back and look at those things in more detail and follow up with that. So some words that have come up from time to time are things like Swidden, which we talked about a little bit, and when we talked about that unit and some of those concepts related to agriculture. All right, so I mean, it's kind of hard to say which ones are more important and which ones aren't. What I will say is go back and look at your textbook and say, okay, what does the textbook pull out as being important? All right, and then I would go look at maybe some Quizlets and say, okay, here are some other terms that are coming up that maybe are not in my book. Maybe they're in a different textbook. Okay. What I have found is that if you look at the vocabulary list in like a prep book, like a Barron's or a Kaplan or a Princeton Review, they usually have way more information. Like they're trying to just throw everything at you. And so a lot of those things are kind of overkill. But look at multiple sources and see what repeats. Okay, what concepts are showing up in my textbook, on my vocab list from my teacher, what's showing up in the test questions and the FRQs I'm getting, what's showing up on, where are the elements that are in all or multiples of those things. Okay, and really focus in on those ideas. Okay, plantation was in my book, and it was in the Quizlet, and it was in the prep book, and it was in the Quizlet. Plantation might be a cool idea, a good idea. As a general rule, when you're studying or when you're preparing, anything you hear about more than once, if you hear about it 2 or 3 times, commit that to be something that's important. Prioritize that, okay, and look back at those things. All right. So, Jeremy, I hope that was helpful. I wish I had a magic ball or magic 8 ball that I could rub and it would tell me what's on the test, but I really honestly don't know. All I can tell you is what conversations I hear at the reading, what sources I look at and what I see, and things like that. So those are some things to think about. Once again, also tie that back to that outline for each unit. Guys, also getting back real quickly to the topic of studying and what to study and how to study, the more time you can spend with your teacher, the better. The more time you can pick their brain about what they know, the more resources that they can provide you and turn you towards, the better. I know in Texas we usually share a class, or we'll have people in classes next to us that will be taking a different geography course than human geography. Look at their textbook. There may be things in their textbook that doesn't show up in yours. It's not going to be as much, but look at their textbook too. What's in there that might fall into the same kind of category? Okay, all right. Oh, I love that we're all getting along so well online today. Okay, all right. Let me refresh here and see if there's any new questions. So I feel like I answered most of the ones that were posted, and to some extent, I have the 2014 Princeton Review. Okay, so Debbie's asked about prep books, just in general. And here's what I had to say about prep books. They're all kind of the same in their quality. The Barron, Princeton Review, Kaplan are kind of the same. Okay, what I will say is this: there is way more information in there than you probably need. Okay, they are trying to make sure all of their bases are covered. They would rather have too much information than not enough. And that makes perfect sense if you're the publisher of one of those books. So do I think this is a good? Yes, I do. However, do not rely on a prep book alone. By this point, you should have gone through the course. You should have gone through all of the resources that your teachers provided you, the text, the activities, the PowerPoints, all of the different resources that you have are there. Use that prep book as a adding up in the prep book that was also in my notes, was also in my textbook and things like that. Okay, so do not use it exclusively, but it is one of many tools that you should be using at this point in the year. All right, I'm going to talk a little bit about urbanization today in the 15 minutes that I kind of have left. We have had a good conversation. Hopefully you've been able to ease some anxiety about the test itself. But I want to talk about these a couple of really interesting things about urbanization. I'll go more into urbanization next week. Our videos will be about urbanization starting on either, I don't know if they're going to go up on Saturday or Sunday or Monday, but one of those days. You should look at those before our time on Wednesday, ask lots of questions. So hopefully you are at that point in the year. And the urbanization unit in our textbook is huge. It's the biggest chapter. But it not necessarily has the most information in it. There's lots of pictures and stuff. So some things from urbanization that you'll want to know, okay, and I touched on some of this a little bit, is how does the urban center or structures change over time? I would spend most of your time looking at North American city models, so looking at your Burgess concentric ring model, looking at your Hoyt sector model, looking at your multiple nuclei model, looking at your urban realms model. And the thing to remember about those things is how are the shape and formation and function of these city models change over time, and what determines those changes? One of the things that I think is a very key factor in understanding why these cities evolve and change in their structure and function over time is the role of transportation. As transportation networks get bigger, as they get longer, as they get more sophisticated and more advanced, so does the shape and size of the city. So to give you an example, I live in Sherman, Texas. Sherman, Texas is about let me rephrase that. It's about 40 miles away from where I work in the North Dallas suburbs. Okay, so it's 40 miles away. I can get to work in the morning in about 45 minutes, and that's with traffic in this awful place called McKinney. It's like that place in The Lion King where Mufasa tells Simba never to go. That's McKinney. Don't ever go there. Okay, it's horrible on traffic days. Anyway, but I drive through that. It takes me about 45 minutes. 100 years ago, that would not have been possible. The idling that distance daily, the idea of being able to commute like that daily would not have been possible. Okay, and this is partially because of the role that transportation has played in changing the structure and function of urban areas. Okay, remember what also is causing this is deliberate, intentional things done by governments, done by people within populations, right? So we talked about after World War II, how suburbanization becomes a big deal. People are moving out of the city center and into these outlying areas because they've been the government and our society is promoting, you want to have a white picket fence and a house and 3 or 4, 7 children, however many, and you got to do that out there. Okay, the perfect life, the idyllic, romanticized way of living happens out there, not in here. So as that process occurs, as men are returning from war, going back to work, as women are leaving the workforce, going back home, as we see the baby boom happen and there's all kinds of children everywhere, most of that is going to occur in the suburban centers, or at least that's where most people want to be. Okay, and those who have the economic means to do so are going to take advantage of that. So this is when we begin to see the multi-nuclei model taking place as these urban centers begin to expand and the populations move outward. Okay, transportation allows for movement from those outer areas into the city center. Okay, if you've ever watched the show Mad Men, which is in its final season on AMC. And the first couple of seasons, Don Draper, who's the main character, travels from the suburbs of New York into the city center every day. It takes place in the 1960s. So it's about 10 or 15 years after this kind of movement kind of really begins, okay? The other thing that happens as part of this is over time, as more and more employees are moving further out, eventually employees start to say, hey, it would really be nice if I could live closer to work, okay? And so rather than they move into the city center, a lot of times businesses will start to move out to them. Because here's the thing. If an employee, if a company can move closer to their employees, then that employee can spend more time at work as opposed to spending time commuting, right? So even if they split that extra time that they make up from not commuting between home and work, the company gets more work out of their work time out of their employees. So we begin to see economic activities and businesses also beginning to shift outward. So the population moves out, so does the businesses themselves, creating these multi-nuclei models. As this trend continues, as the spread continues, we begin to see these massive urban and suburban areas beginning to grow together, and we begin to see just huge, massive urban areas develop. Places like Los Angeles or Southern California, which is just massive place with all of these different things. And this is kind of representative of the idea of urban realms, the urban realms model, as these ideas, as these places continue to spread out, as they become self-sufficient, as their need to go into the city center is slowly reduced. Okay. The downside of that is that now that CBD, that central business district, and the economic activities within the city itself are also going to be reduced. Okay. So this leads to more and more cities trying to find ways to revive that. How do we revive the city center? Gentrification, right? We're going to encourage our sinks and our dinks to move into the urban centers. We're going to provide opportunities for them for urban renewal in older neighborhoods and more rundown neighborhoods. They're going to come in. We're going to build or encourage development of entertainment, of shops, of nightclubs, things that are going to be more appealing to sinks and dinks, right? In the city center, we're going to create, new residential opportunities there. We're going to create, just different things that are going to allow for these older parts of town that have begun to decline because of this migration to be revived again for different purposes. And so this idea of urban renewal, this idea of reurbanization, and this idea of migration of people who have the means to live in an urban center based on the standard of living and the cost of living, but the means to do it, who do not have familial ties to the suburbs. And let's face it, when you're a single 20-something with no kids, the suburbs are kind of lame. Okay, they're cool when you have kids and all, and Chuck E. Cheese and all, but they're kind of lame. Okay. And so what ends up happening is this urban renewal happens in response to this decline. The drawback to this is it's not like these places were empty. These were places where people were living. So people are going to who were living in these areas, because they were in decline, they were less valuable, less expensive, easier to afford. Those people are then going to be pushed out, and they then have to find new areas to live, new places to go in order to sustain themselves, in order to kind of be able to take care of those kinds of things. Okay, so those are some things that are important about kind of the movement of urbanization. Also, be familiar with the role that some, let's just say, unscrupulous or unethical practices played in determining the demographics of urban areas. For example, where do people live within that urban areas? We've talked about sinks and dinks. Once we get beyond that group, most of the people who reside in residential and in urban areas tend to be of lower income. And unfortunately, when we talk about low income and we talk about urban, we usually also mean that they are ethnic minorities. So a lot of your traditional African American groups, traditional Hispanic groups within those urban centers often meet both of those criteria, urban and lower income. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Those are wonderful people with wonderful cultures. The problem is, though, that what it ends up creating is a concentration of poverty, concentration of these factors into specific places. And it becomes very difficult for people in places of concentrated poverty to ever really get out of that situation. The economic opportunities aren't there. The social and economic capital necessary, the connections that people need in order to get out of those situations are very hard to come by. So what has happened as a result of some of these migratory patterns is this clustering and concentration of lower income people into particular neighborhoods. And this is not just coincidence. It didn't just happen. It was actually done intentionally, in some cases for unethical reasons, and some it was done, and this was the unintended consequence. Okay, for example, for a long time, it was policy of governments to support people who could not easily afford housing. And the way they would do this was to build housing projects. The problem is that this once again added to that concentration problem. Okay, you also had an issue of how do we of people manipulating people, using some unethical and unscrupulous kinds of things in order to push those people out. So things like redlining, where we're going to say, hey, you really can't afford to live here, so we're going to put you over here. Or we're going to, make the housing over here intentionally too expensive for these groups of people so that they'll stay here. Or we're going to encourage higher income people to move out as soon as lower income people move in. So we're doing some unethical things to kind of create and manipulate those structures as well. Okay, so those are some big trends in urbanization. I don't know if that's where you are or if you just finished with that. I'll do a lot more with urbanization next week. I kind of don't have a lot of time, but I didn't want to kind of toss out some of those big concepts. There is one question that I did not get to, and I just now saw it. So let me go back and I guess Mountain. Mountain or Martin asks, what do you think is the best way to memorize vocabulary? It's interesting that you asked that. I am not a big memorizer. It's really not the way that my brain works. So it's not something that I'm particularly good at. But what I first of all come up with some kind of method. Like we talked about the flashcard method. We talked about using Quizlet. I like to go through and maybe come up with some kind of mnemonic devices. It might help to chunk your vocabulary into similar terms. So things that are related to each other in some way. So assimilation, acculturation, you know, authenticity, commodification. We're going to group those together, and we're going to memorize what the differences are between them. Nation state, stateless nation, overbounded, underbounded states. We're going to lump those two together and kind of think about the differences between those. I think that's where a lot of students run into problems with vocabulary, is when words are similar, and understanding some of the subtle differences between some of those things. So I would definitely try to group those or lump those things together, and maybe put them under a broader umbrella, a broader conceptual umbrella. This is also where that outline could come in handy. One of the things that I had done in the past is taken my outline and put it in a Word document, and then I would type out the vocabulary that goes with each of those outline bullet points underneath it. So it might say, measurements of population, and underneath that I'll have, CBR, CDR, ALI, infant mortality, and I'll have all those listed there. Or, measures of economic growth, and I've got GDP, GNI, blah, 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 blah. So kind of grouping them that way also helps. In general, I find that while the vocabulary is very, very, very important, I also want to make sure that you don't spend so much time memorizing the individual details that you forget about some of those bigger connections, some of those bigger overarching concepts that relate to each other. Okay. Once again, when you are doing vocabulary or anything, the more you write, the more you are going to kind of commit to memory. Oh, one last question came in. What are sinks and dinks? Oh, I'm glad Debbie asked that. This is one of my favorite concepts because I am a dink. I am a lifelong committed dinks. A sink stands for single income, no kids. Dink stands for dual income, no kids. And so basically we're talking about single individuals, we're talking about married couples, or partnered couples, whatever term we're using, or whatever happens in Michigan, then it's a couple weeks. Anyway, basically we're talking about people that are usually college educated or of higher education, that have disposable income because they don't have children. Yes, guys, guess what? You are expensive. And so, there are wonderful things about children. I love working with kids. I teach them all the time, but I don't have any. And instead of that, I have more money to spend on me. How about that? Anyway, so that's what sinks and dinks are. And because sinks and dinks have more disposable income, because children don't play the same role in their lives, they have more flexibility about where they can live and what they look for in where they live. So if I am a sink as a dink, I am not going to look for necessarily the best school system for my children, because I don't have any children, and therefore that's lower on my priority list. Now, as a teacher, I care about that, but not as a parent. Okay, I'm not necessarily looking for the best, minor or little league baseball program. I'm not looking for, who has the best dance school or things like that. The distance to a Chuck E. Cheese is not high on my list. Okay, but the things that my wife and I might look for in moving might be things like, where is the best art museum, or where is the symphony located, or where can we go, out with our friends for a couple hours after work, and things like that. So we're going to be looking for some different types of things, and therefore sinks and dinks create this different demographic category that exists within urban centers that have just very different priorities, and therefore urban centers like to provide for them. Okay? All right. All right, we are about out of time, and I have one question from Daniel. And Daniel, I am not exactly sure how to answer that question because I'm not sure what you're referencing. So what I will do is, if you want to clarify that question, I will put an answer here on the page, and I just need a little more detail about what you mean by the green line, because that could have several different meanings, and I kind of need a context for that. Anyway, so give me a context for that, and I'll be glad to respond on the questions page in a response. Okay, guys, thank you for your patience tonight. Thank you for sticking with me after we started a little bit late. Thank you for all your awesome questions. Guys, I know that you're getting anxious about studying. I know that you're getting anxious about the test. Guys, don't kill yourself over this, okay? A little, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time, okay? Take some time, focus, organize, structure, okay? Be disciplined in your studying. Do not be random. Do not be chaotic. Do not be haphazard, okay? Develop good habits now. They will serve you well in the future. Don't be like young Mr. C and waste lots of time studying badly, all right? So, all right. That's all I have for today, and we will see you next week, all right?